A racist teacher crossed the line when she bullied a black student in front of the entire class. But when the principal stormed in and revealed the girl was his daughter, the teacher's world exploded in a way she never saw coming. This is a story you won't believe until the end. The classroom buzzes with quiet energy as students shuffle papers and whisper to each other. Among them sits Zora Taylor, a bright 16-year-old black girl with deep brown eyes that reflect both intelligence and uncertainty. Her fingers nervously tap against her copy of Toni Morrison's Beloved as she glances around the mostly white faces of Westlake High's advanced placement English class. It's only been 3 weeks since she transferred here. 3 weeks of being the new girl. 3 weeks of carrying a secret that weighs heavily on her shoulders. That her father is Marcus Taylor, the school's new principal, and the first black administrator in Westlake's 60-year history. The classroom door swings open with authority. Ms. Eleanor Winters strides in, her silver-streaked hair pulled into a tight bun, her posture ramrod straight. She's a 25-year veteran of Westlake High, decorated with teaching awards that line her wall like trophies. The white students straighten in their seats, a mix of respect and fear crossing their faces. "Good morning, everyone," Ms. Winters announces, her voice crisp as autumn air. Her gaze sweeps across the room with a practiced smile that reaches most students. But when her eyes land on Zora, something shifts. The smile doesn't quite disappear, but it freezes, becoming something closer to a grimace. As Ms. Winters begins the discussion on Beloved, Zora raises her hand, heart thumping against her ribs. Her previous school's English teacher had praised her literary analysis. Surely her insights would be valued here too. "Ms. Taylor," Ms. Winters acknowledges with a coolness that doesn't match her tone with other students. "I think Morrison is showing how trauma lives in the body, how Seth's past haunts her physically, not just mentally," Zora offers, her voice steady despite her nerves. Ms. Winters barely lets her finish before replying, "That's an interesting attempt at analysis, but let's hear from someone who might have a clearer understanding of the text." Heat rises to Zora's cheeks as Ms. Winters calls on Tyler, a blonde boy who hasn't even finished the reading assignment. "I think it's just about how she feels guilty about stuff," Tyler offers with a shrug. "Excellent point about guilt as a motivating factor, Tyler." Ms. Winters beams. That's exactly the kind of thoughtful reading this novel requires. Zora's hand slowly lowers to her desk. She wants to speak up, to challenge this blatant dismissal, but her father's words echo in her mind. "We need to fly under the radar for now, Zora. I'm still new here, still building relationships. We can't afford to make waves just yet." The class ends with Ms. Winters returning their essays. She places them face down on each desk, with brief comments of praise. When she reaches Zora, she pauses, holding the paper just out of reach. "Ms. Taylor, I'm curious, did you have considerable help with this essay? The ideas seem somewhat advanced." Her voice carries through the silent classroom. 23 pairs of eyes turn toward Zora as she reaches for her paper, marked with a glaring B- despite analysis that earned her consistent A's at her previous school. "No, Ms. Winters, I wrote it myself," Zora replies, her voice barely above a whisper. Ms. Winters responds, skepticism dripping from that single syllable. "Well, at Westlake we maintain certain standards. Perhaps you'll adjust to them eventually." The bell rings, releasing a classroom of students who avoid Zora's eyes as they file out. She sits frozen, clutching her unfairly graded paper, wondering how many more days she can endure this treatment in silence. Have you ever been underestimated, or had your abilities questioned because of who you are? The pattern becomes undeniable as October stretches into November. What began as subtle dismissals transforms into something more targeted, more deliberate. Today, Ms. Winters announces a group project on literary themes, her voice carrying its usual authority. "I'll be assigning groups," she declares, reading from her list. Names are paired together until she reaches Zora. Ms. Taylor, given your unique perspective, I think you'll benefit from working independently. Zora's stomach tightens as she glances around the room. Every other student has partners. Only she sits alone, isolated once again. From 2 desks over, Aidan catches her eye. He's witnessed these moments before, noticed the different treatment, but quickly looks away, uncomfortable with his own silent complicity. After class, Ms. Winters calls Zora to her desk while other students file out. I wanted to tell you how articulate you were in today's discussion, Ms. Winters says with a tight smile that doesn't reach her eyes. It's quite impressive, really. The false praise stings worse than criticism. Zora knows what's beneath those words, the surprise that she can speak well, the underlying assumption that articulation is somehow unexpected from a black student. Thank you, Zora manages, though the words taste bitter on her tongue. Ms. Winters leans forward. I've been meaning to suggest, have you considered transferring to regular English? The pace might be more suitable for you. Outside in the hallway, Jasmine Ramirez waits, her dark eyes understanding as Zora emerges from the classroom. Let me guess, Jasmine says as they walk toward the cafeteria. She did the "you're so articulate" thing? Or was it the maybe you should take an easier classes suggestion? Both, Zora admits, relief washing over her at finally having someone who understands. Welcome to the Winters experience for anyone who isn't white, Jasmine replies. Last year, she told me my essay on Sandra Cisneros showed remarkable comprehension, considering English isn't your first language. She rolls her eyes. My family has been in California for 4 generations. English is my only language. The cafeteria at Westlake High tells its own story. Though legally desegregated in 1974, invisible lines divide the space, white students clustered in the center, black and Latino students around the edges. The faculty table reflects the same division, with only 2 teachers of color among 15 staff members. A trophy case in the main hallway displays the school's history, photographs of all white classes until the mid-70s, then gradual integration. But even in the most recent photos, the power structure remains clear. White faces in positions of authority, students of color at the margins. That evening, Zora finds her father in his home office, surrounded by budget reports and curriculum guides. Principal Marcus Taylor's face shows the weight of his position, the first black principal in Westlake's history, hired after community pressure and a discrimination lawsuit forced the board to diversify leadership. How was school today? He asks, setting aside his papers. Zora considers lying, protecting him from one more burden. Instead, she tells him about Ms. Winters, about the isolation and the constant questioning of her abilities. Marcus removes his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. I've heard whispers about her from other students, but no formal complaints. His voice carries resignation. The board is watching my every move, Zora. Half of them think I'm going to upend their precious traditions. The other half expect me to transform decades of inequality overnight. He explains the political tightrope he walks daily, needing to build alliances with long-standing faculty while trying to create space for change. Give me time to establish myself, he pleads. Then we can address these issues properly. The next morning, Zora approaches Vice Principal Matthews, a white man with thinning hair, who's worked at Westlake for 20 years. She carefully describes Ms. Winters' pattern of behavior. Ms. Taylor, he interrupts, barely looking up from his computer. Ms. Winters has an exemplary teaching record. I'm sure these are simple misunderstandings. Perhaps you're being a bit sensitive to normal classroom dynamics. As weeks pass, Zora's hand rises less frequently in English class. She second-guesses every response, rewrites every assignment multiple times. The night before class, her stomach knots with anxiety. Her reflection in the mirror shows shadows beneath her eyes that weren't there in September. During today's discussion on Hamlet's character motivations, Zora forces herself to contribute, making a point about his psychological complexity. Ms. Winters sighs dramatically. "I don't expect everyone to understand literary nuance," she announces to the class, especially students from different educational backgrounds. Her eyes lock directly on Zora, the implication hanging heavily in the air. Something snaps inside Zora. All these weeks of silence, of swallowing injustice, crystallize into a moment of clarity. "Excuse me, Ms. Winters," she says, her voice stronger than it's been in weeks. "But what exactly do you mean by different educational backgrounds?" The classroom falls silent. Ms. Winters's eyebrows rise in surprise at being challenged. "I simply mean that some students come from schools with more rigorous academic standards than others," she replies coolly. "My previous school had extremely high standards," Zora counters. "Yet you've dismissed or interrupted nearly every contribution I've made in this class. I'm curious why my insights are consistently devalued when they demonstrate the same depth of analysis you praise from other students." Ms. Winters's face hardens as she launches into a speech about maintaining standards and merit-based evaluation that thinly veils the truth. In her classroom, Zora's intelligence threatens a worldview where black excellence doesn't exist. What would you do if you were in Zora's position? Would you speak up or stay silent? Parent-teacher conference night bathes Westlake High in fluorescent light as families move from classroom to classroom, eager to discuss their children's academic progress. Zora sits at a table in the main hallway, checking in parents and directing them to the right rooms. Her father assigned her this role, thinking it would keep her away from direct encounters with Ms. Winters. 3 white parents stand near Zora's table, waiting for their scheduled time with Ms. Winters. The English teacher approaches them with her award-winning smile, the one that never quite reaches her eyes when directed at Zora. "I just want to assure you," Ms. Winters tells them, loud enough for Zora to hear, "that I hold everyone to exactly the same standards in my classroom." Her eyes drift meaningfully toward Zora. Despite pressure to do otherwise these days. The words hang in the air like poison. The implication is clear, that students like Zora seek special treatment rather than equal treatment. That her presence somehow threatens academic standards. Zora's hand trembles as she marks another parent's arrival on her clipboard. For weeks, she's documented every dismissal, every backhanded compliment, every instance of being held to different standards than her white classmates. The journal in her backpack contains 23 detailed incidents, each one a paper cut to her sense of self-worth. As the evening winds down, Zora makes a decision. She can no longer protect her father's position at the cost of her own dignity. She pulls out her phone and sends a text. "Dad, I need to talk to you about Ms. Winters. It's important. Room 237 after conference's end." The last parent leaves Ms. Winters' classroom just after 8:30 p.m. Zora takes a deep breath, clutches her journal, and walks through the open door. Ms. Winters looks up from her desk, surprise quickly replaced by that familiar, cool assessment. "Ms. Taylor, conference night is over. If your father has questions about your performance, he can schedule an appointment." "This isn't about my father," Zora says, her voice steadier than she expected. "This is about how you've treated me since my first day in your class." Ms. Winters' eyebrows rise. "Excuse me? For the past 2 months you've interrupted me, isolated me, questioned my abilities, and graded my work more harshly than my classmates." Zora places her journal on the desk. "I've documented every incident." Something shifts in Ms. Winters' expression, the careful mask of professionalism slipping to reveal something harder underneath. "You know, Ms. Taylor, this is exactly the problem with education today." She stands, her voice taking on an edge Zora hasn't heard before. When certain students don't perform well, rather than working harder, they claim discrimination. "My work is excellent," Zora counters. "My previous teachers." Your previous school likely operated under different standards, Ms. Winters interrupts, her voice rising. Perhaps they felt pressure to inflate grades for certain students, but I refuse to lower my standards or provide special treatment based on anything other than merit. You've never given my work a fair evaluation based on merit, Zora responds, feeling a strange calm, replacing her usual anxiety. You decided who I was the moment I walked into your classroom. Ms. Winters' composure cracks further. What I decided was to maintain the academic excellence this school was known for before all these new diversity mandates. Some students simply aren't prepared for rigorous education, and no amount of special treatment will change that. Is that your professional assessment of my daughter's academic abilities, Ms. Winters? The deep voice from the doorway freezes both of them. Principal Marcus Taylor stands there, his tall frame filling the entrance, his expression unreadable. The color drains from Ms. Winters' face as understanding dawns. Her mouth opens and closes wordlessly. Principal Taylor, she finally manages. I wasn't aware. I didn't realize. That Zora is my daughter. Yes, I gathered that. His voice remains unnervingly calm as he enters the room. What I'd like to understand is what educational theory you're drawing from that suggests students should be treated differently based on their race. Ms. Winters' shock transforms into defensive indignation. That is absolutely not what I was suggesting. I have 25 years of exemplary teaching evaluations. I've won the district's Excellence in Education Award 3 times. And yet, Principal Taylor says, placing a folder on her desk, I've received 7 complaints about your treatment of minority students in the past month alone. Former students have been contacting me since my first week as principal. Those are misunderstandings, Ms. Winters insists, though uncertainty creeps into her voice. I maintain high standards for all students. Some simply aren't willing to put in the necessary work. Like me? Zora asks, finding strength in her father's presence. I've rewritten papers 4 times trying to meet your impossible standards. I've raised my hand and been ignored while you praise less developed answers from white students. I stopped speaking in class because you made me question whether I belonged in AP English at all. Her voice grows stronger with each word. But it wasn't about my abilities. It was about your perception of what a black student could achieve. Every time I demonstrated intelligence, you seemed threatened by it. Zora opens her journal. October 3rd, Ms. Winters suggested I get appropriate help on my essay, implying I couldn't have written it myself. October 10th, assigned everyone partners except me because of my unique perspective. October 17th, praised Tyler for making the exact point I had made 5 minutes earlier. Ms. Winters' carefully constructed worldview, that she's simply a guardian of academic standards, begins visibly crumbling as the evidence mounts. The realization that she might be forced to confront her own bias registers as panic in her eyes. I have always believed in maintaining the highest standards, she says, her voice less certain. That's what makes Westlake exceptional. Excellence doesn't require diminishing black students, Principal Taylor replies. Your definition of standards seems remarkably flexible depending on who's being evaluated. Zora feels something unlock inside her, the weight of months of self-doubt lifting as she finally speaks her full truth. The worst part wasn't the grades or the isolation, she says. It was how you made me question my own mind. I started to believe maybe I wasn't as smart as I thought. Maybe my previous teachers had been too easy on me. Maybe I didn't belong in advanced classes. Her voice catches, then strengthens. Do you know what that does to a student? To be told either directly or indirectly day after day that your thoughts aren't valuable, that your intelligence is surprising, that you're an exception to what's expected of people who look like you. Ms. Winters stands frozen, perhaps truly hearing a black student's voice for the first time. Have you ever witnessed someone having to face the consequences of their prejudice? What happened? The news spreads through Westlake High like wildfire. Ms. Winters, the decorated English teacher, has been placed on administrative leave, pending a full review of her classroom practices. There is no public spectacle, no dramatic dismissal, just an empty classroom and a substitute teacher quietly taking her place. The hallways buzz with conflicting reactions. Some students express shock, unable to reconcile the respected teacher they knew with the allegations of racial bias. Others, particularly white parents who've seen Ms. Winters lavish praise on their children, write angry emails defending her high standards and traditional values. But in the wake of her absence, something else happens. Students of color begin coming forward with their own stories, not just about Ms. Winters, but about patterns of treatment across the school. A Latino boy describes being discouraged from taking honors math despite his A grades. A black girl recounts being followed around the school library by a suspicious administrator. The trickle becomes a stream, then a river of experiences, too consistent to dismiss. Principal Taylor sits in his office, reviewing these accounts with a heavy heart. He opens his desk drawer and pulls out a faded yearbook from his own high school days. A much younger Marcus Taylor stares back from the page, one of only 7 black students in his graduating class. His English teacher had written in his yearbook, "Surprisingly well-spoken. You're a credit to your people." The memory still stings 30 years later. It was teachers like that who had inspired him to become an educator himself, to ensure other black students wouldn't have their potential questioned or dismissed. At the first faculty meeting after the incident, tension fills the air. Principal Taylor stands before his staff, many of whom still view him as an outsider. "We're not here to demonize any individual," he begins, "but to recognize that education doesn't happen in a vacuum. Our biases, conscious or unconscious, affect how we teach, who we call on, whose potential we nurture, and whose we limit." He announces a series of listening sessions for students, curriculum reviews, and mandatory professional development on culturally responsive teaching. Some teachers shift uncomfortably, others nod in agreement. Meanwhile, Zora experiences her own transformation. The girl who once shrank in her seat now walks the halls with quiet confidence. With Jasmine and other students of color, she starts a group called Student Voices, creating a space where they can share experiences and support each other. "It's not just about one teacher," Zora explains during their first meeting in the school library. "It's about systems that were never designed with us in mind." The group discusses how racism operates beyond obvious slurs or exclusion, how it lives in tracking systems that funnel white students into advanced courses while discouraging students of color, in disciplinary policies that punish black students more harshly for the same behaviors, in curriculums that treat white authors as universal and everyone else as supplementary. Across town, Ms. Winters sits in a cultural competency workshop, arms crossed, defensively. "I've always treated all students the same," she insists to the facilitator. "I never mentioned race once in my classroom." "Sometimes treating everyone the same means ignoring important differences in experience," the facilitator gently challenges. "Would you teach Shakespeare the same way to English language learners as native speakers?" Ms. Winters starts to respond, then pauses, her certainty wavering. For the first time, she begins considering that her definition of high standards might be narrower than she realized, shaped by her own cultural lens rather than universal truth. Back at Westlake, change comes not as a revolution, but as a slow tide. The English department reviews its reading list, adding more diverse voices alongside the classics. Teachers begin attending each other's classes, offering feedback on classroom dynamics they observe. A new anonymous reporting system allows students to share concerns about unfair treatment. It isn't perfect. Old habits persist. Some teachers view the changes as bureaucratic hoops to jump through rather than meaningful transformation. But small shifts begin taking hold. Zora finds allies in unexpected places. Aidan, the white student who had noticed Ms. Winters' behavior but stayed silent, joins student voices, listening more than speaking as he confronts his own complicity. "I knew something was wrong," he admits. "I just didn't know what to do about it." 4 months later, at a school board meeting, curriculum changes are on the agenda. Zora steps up to the podium during public comment, her voice clear and confident. "Education should open doors, not close them," she tells the board members. "Every student deserves to be seen, to have their potential recognized, to feel they belong in any classroom they enter. That doesn't happen by accident. It happens through conscious effort to examine our practices and beliefs." As she speaks, she notices a familiar face in the audience. Ms. Winters sits near the back, no longer the intimidating figure from September. She listens with complex emotions crossing her face: discomfort, defensiveness, but also perhaps the beginning of understanding. Their eyes meet briefly before Ms. Winters looks away. After the meeting, Zora and her father walk to their car through the cool evening air. "You know, nothing changes overnight," Principal Taylor says, placing a hand on her shoulder. "When I was your age, I couldn't have imagined a black principal at a school like Westlake. Progress is slow, but it happens." "It only happens because people speak up," Zora replies, "because they refuse to accept things as they are." The next morning, Zora enters her new English class, now taught by Ms. Rodriguez, a young teacher who brings fresh energy and diverse perspectives to the curriculum. As the discussion begins on Zora Neale Hurston's "Their Eyes Were Watching God," Zora's hand rises into the air without hesitation, her voice ready to be heard. The journey isn't over, the work continues. But in this moment, in this classroom, something has shifted, not just for Zora, but for Westlake High itself. The space to speak, to question, to learn has expanded, making room for voices that were once silenced or dismissed. It's not the end of the story, but a new chapter beginning. What one change would make your school or workplace more inclusive for everyone?